When you're ready, we'll start. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and to those who are watching from far away. We come to session 16, with the interruption of the royal funeral. So Elijah, whom we left sleeping under a tree, has been sleeping for a very long time before we pick up his story this afternoon. And apart from the story of Elijah and Elisha, the rest of section 16 is horrible. It's so bad that you really are surprised to find these stories in the Bible. But for the sake of continuity, I've fitted them in. And all I'm going to say to those of you who are reading or looking in from elsewhere, don't do section 16 at bedtime. It's horrible. Anyway, let's get started. At the end of last session, we left the prophet Elijah fast asleep, exhausted both physically, emotionally and religiously, and only wanting to die. He'd fled from the northern kingdom to escape the murderous wrath of Queen Jezebel. Do you remember that map? The two kingdoms, north and south. The competition on Mount Carmel had taken place. Jezebel threatened to kill Elijah, and he fled for his life. He went through the northern kingdom into the southern kingdom, where he sank down exhausted, escaping the murderous wrath of Jezebel. Well, she was Ahab's prestigious queen, and when after Elijah had ordered the killing of 450 prophets of her father's Phoenician god, Baal-Melkart, and reawakened the people's allegiance to Yahweh in Israel at Mount Carmel, the question, however, remained: what had he achieved? While Jezebel was still queen and could persuade her husband to do her will, whenever he, Ahab, of course, was not on the battlefield. But after a long sleep, let's get rid of the map. After a long sleep, Elijah woke to find food and drink mysteriously beside him for nourishment. And a day later, more food appeared. And refreshed, he then carried on his journey, fleeing back to the origins of Yahwism in his desperation. Remember, we're now dependent on the Northern Kingdom's collection of stories, which we know as the E code. Remember, the J code was Judah. Now the Northern Kingdom's code is the E code. And it had a greater emphasis on Moses and the law of Yahweh. And it describes the holy place of Theophany, now in Exodus, as a smoking, quaking mountain of mystery. Here the E code uses the other name for Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. Do you remember it? We had this picture in the time of Moses. Well, when Elijah arrived, he was overwhelmed, because that's how it looks in the sunshine. But remember, it can be very awesome. And Elijah was overawed by the experience of this quaking mountain. While he was there, he heard the demanding question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, feeling very self-righteous, "I have been very zealous for Yahweh, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." There was no answer, other than being told to stand outside the cave and experience the presence of Yahweh. Well, Elijah did experience a great wind that was strong enough to break rocks in pieces. He also felt the mountain quaking under his feet, and he saw the fiery lightning. But uncomfortably, he did not experience the presence of Yahweh in them, as Moses had done. And then, when all that subsided, there was a sound of sheer silence. Psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, Elijah was fragile, but just the sort of opportunity that the Holy Spirit uses to great effect. And in that sound of sheer silence, Elijah heard within himself the same question as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But this time his answer sounded like a lame excuse of self-pity. There was certainly no word of "well done." He then began to realize that he had no business to be there at all. Retreat into the past was no answer. Yahweh's work was to be done back in Israel, where the people were still in danger of the forceful Queen Jezebel. And suddenly Elijah felt exhilarated and invigorated. Sorry. Don't know what I've done here. Oh, wait a minute. You've been through Mount Sinai? Yep. Right. We now go out. There's no more pictures, I'm afraid. It's all story. Suddenly Elijah felt reinvigorated. Yahweh was indeed a God of action, sending him, Elijah, back into the fray to act on Yahweh's behalf. He returned with 3 tasks to carry out. It's always easier to have something to do when you get there, isn't it? He first had to find and appoint Elisha to be his companion and disciple. And then to solve the problem of Jezebel, he had to get involved in the politics of the day. First by finding and anointing a man called Hazael to become the new king of Syria, next door to Israel. And similarly, to find Jehu, a soldier, to lead a rebellion in Israel against Ahab's family. And he was to start a new dynasty in Israel. By word of encouragement, Elijah was told that he was not alone in Israel, for there were at least 7,000 loyal worshippers of Yahweh still there. Well, he went back, but he achieved only the first of those 3 tasks, for it took time. But it would happen because such was the power of the prophet's spoken word and action. Well, we must pause for a while here to reflect on the long-term results of Elijah's theological lesson at Horeb Sinai, that sound of sheer silence, in which words come to you in the quietness of your mind. It took about 100 years, or 3 generations, for such a new idea of Yahweh's contacts with his prophets to sink in and gradually mature. There'll be no more retreats to Sinai, only a new style of prophet with the interior conviction from Yahweh to become a new loner. like Amos and Hosea, etc. They found Yahweh in the sheer silence of their own hearts, and then had courage to speak with authority, "Thus says Yahweh." And on they would go, regardless of the outcome for themselves. Now this would be more valuable to Yahweh than the most extravagant sacrificial event that anyone can possibly imagine. But more of that next time. Back to our story. During Elijah's absence, King Ahab again proved himself a great soldier in battle when he repelled a huge attack on Samaria by King Ben-Hadad of Syria. Nevertheless, at home, he was still very susceptible to Jezebel's opinions, as we learn from the story of Elijah's return. It concerns a significant vineyard near a palace of Ahab in Jezreel. Ahab tried to do a deal with its owner, Naboth, and to buy it for a vegetable garden, or in return for giving him a different, even better vineyard, or cash value. And he was bitterly sad when Naboth refused to do a deal, saying it had been his family's ancestral vineyard for very many years. Ahab accepted his answer and went home. Jezebel was concerned that he was depressed and not even interested in his dinner, and asked the reason. Now Jezebel, remember, was her father's forceful daughter, and reacted as her father would have done when she heard Ahab's story. Her comment was, "Are you not king in Israel?" She had no tolerance for Ahab's acceptance of Naboth's refusal, and told her husband to leave it to her. Behind his back, she engineered the murder of Naboth by writing letters in her husband's name and sealing them before sending them to the elders of Jezreel. They carried out the orders in the letters, and at a feast which they organized, with Naboth present, they arranged for two scoundrels to appear and publicly charged Naboth with having cursed both Yahweh and the king. Well, the two witnesses were all that were needed to prove guilt, and Naboth was removed and stoned to death. You no doubt remember that when you come to the trial of Jesus. Two witnesses were all that were required, and they couldn't find them for Jesus. Anyway, they did for Naboth. He was removed from the feast and stoned to death. When Jezebel heard the news, she merely told Ahab to go and take possession of the vineyard because Naboth was dead. Without asking any questions, Ahab set out immediately to take possession of the coveted vineyard. Imagine his surprise when he arrived and found none other than Elijah there, waiting for him. And his words said it all. "Have you found me, O mine enemy?" He knew he had not kept the precepts of the law of Moses. He had coveted. He had murdered. Now he was about to steal what he wanted. Elijah prophetically told him that he and all his family would not survive on the throne. And as for Jezebel, and I quote, "Yahweh said, the dogs shall eat Jezebel within the bounds of Jezreel." Ahab immediately repented, knowing that he'd done wrong. He tore off his clothes, put on sackcloth, and Yahweh accepted his repentance and told Elijah that the declared retribution would not happen in his time, but later in the time of his sons. Ahab, the soldier, went to war again with the king of Judah against the king of Syria. The two kingdoms had joined together by a treaty. And Ahab died in that battle a brave soldier's death. He was wounded by an arrow, And in order not to create panic among his troops, he ordered his charioteer to prop him up as if nothing were wrong. And gradually, and in the heat of the day, he bled to death. His body was brought back to Samaria for burial, and he was succeeded by his son Hazael, but only for 2 years. One day, Azariah fell from the lattice window of his upper chamber in Samaria and was seriously wounded. He sent messengers, not to Yahweh, to Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to ask if he would recover. But Elijah met the messengers and asked, "Is there no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?" The messengers merely returned to Samaria and to the king described the man who had sent them back, a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist, that traditional description of Elijah. Azariah knew immediately that it was Elijah and eventually summoned him only to be told that he would die. And die he did, and was succeeded by his brother Jehoram. You don't need to remember any of these names at all. And then came the time for Elijah's life on earth to end. But according to the story, he didn't die. Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal to Bethel, and then on to Jericho. That was down by the River Jordan, you remember. And there they met a band of prophets, the ecstatic variety. And Elijah told Elisha to stay with them. But Elisha refused. So Elijah let him continue with him to the River Jordan. On the bank, Elijah parted the waters of the river with his cloak, and they crossed to the far side. And I quote, "On the far side, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven." Well, this story is very dramatic and gave rise to the idea that he was the greatest of the prophets after Moses. And again, we meet that again in the New Testament story of the transfiguration of Jesus, when Moses and Elijah were the two representatives of the Old Testament witnessing the transfiguration. Well, Elisha returned, using Elijah's cloak to part the water again, and having thus inherited Elijah's authority, he continued to fulfill the tasks that Elijah had been given at Mount Horeb or Sinai. Before that, however, we have a group of Elisha stories. They bear a remarkable likeness to the early stories of Elijah. So how they got repeated and attached to Elisha, we leave to the mysteries of the Old Testament. Elisha is said to have added salt to bad water to make it drinkable. He cursed some boys who called him a bald head, and they were mauled by bears coming out of the woods. He saved a widow's 2 sons from her creditors who wanted to sell them into slavery, and then miraculously ensured that her jar of oil never diminished, so she could sell it and pay off all her debt. Then he met the Shunammite woman who gave him hospitality. Elisha granted her wish to have a son, even though her husband was elderly, and the son was born and grew up. But one day, when the lad was out with his father, he fell ill and carried home to his mother. The lad died in his mother's arms. The story is vividly told in 2 Kings chapter 4, how the bereaved mother saddled a donkey and set out to find Elisha, who eventually returned with her and restored her son wondrously back to life. Do you remember the stories of Elijah? Almost in parallel the same. But unique in this collection is the story of Naaman. He was the commander of the king of Syria's army in chapter 5. A high-ranking officer in the army of Syria was Naaman. And he'd had military success in the battles against Israel. But Naaman had caught leprosy. And his wife listened to her slave girl who'd been captured from Israel, who said if only he were in Samaria with a prophet there, he could be cured of his leprosy. Well, the king of Aram, Syria, heard this and gave his favoured commander permission to go to Samaria, the enemy, remember, with letter for the king and lots of expensive gifts, hoping for a cure. So Naaman went to the king of Israel, who thought it was all an excuse to pick another quarrel, as he had no powers of healing himself. But Elisha heard of this and sent a message to the king telling him to send Naaman to himself. Naaman went, but when he arrived at Elisha's home, Elisha merely sent a message saying, "Go and wash in the river Jordan 7 times, and your leprosy will be cured." Naaman was angry and left, saying, "I thought for me he would surely have come out, called on the name of Yahweh his God, and would wave his hand over me or somewhere, the spot, and cure the leprosy." And in his rage, he declared that the rivers around Damascus were far better than the Jordan, so why could he not wash in them? When he calmed down a bit, his servants persuaded him to do what the prophet had commanded. After all, he would have done something much more difficult if he'd been told. Why not do the simple thing that the prophet had commanded? Naaman did then go to the river Jordan and immersed himself 7 times, and he was cured of his leprosy. To do him credit, he returned to the prophet and offered him a present as a thank offering. But Elisha declined and could not be persuaded to accept. Then Naaman asked to be given 2 mule loads of Israelite earth. Because remember, people in those days still believed that gods were territorial and had no power except in their own land and their own soil. Hence Naaman's request to be given earth from the territory of Yahweh so he could worship Yahweh from then on, having a little bit of Israel to take home. And he also asked, of course, that he would be pardoned when his official duties in Syria obliged him to appear beside the king to worship the god of Syria, Rimmon. Elisha told him to go in peace. So Naaman began his return, still in possession of all the gifts he'd brought. The story continues with Elisha's servant, a man called Gehazi. Resentful that Elisha had declined any gift, Gehazi rushed off to catch up with Naaman, and he told Naaman that his master had changed his mind. And Naaman readily sent Gehazi back to Elisha with 2 bags of silver and gifts of clothing, which of course Gehazi hid when he got back. Elijah, however, had missed him, and in his absence guessed where he had been. And the story ends with Elisha announcing that Gehazi would from then on suffer from Naaman's leprosy. Well, many more stories follow in 2 Kings chapters 6, 7 and 8, but we'll disregard them. Then we pick up the story of Elisha's visit to Damascus when King Ben-Hadad was ill. The king sent his servant Hazael, remember the name? Yes. The king of Syria sent his servant Hazael to take rich gifts to the prophet and inquire whether he would recover. The prophet found himself in the presence of Hazael and remembered the commission of old Elijah and he wept at what he saw. He announced that the king would recover from his illness, but not for long, as Yahweh had shown him that Hazael himself would become the next king of Syria. Elisha was weeping because he recognized the abilities of Hazael and feared for the future of Israel. Hazael returned to King Ben-Hadad and told him he would recover from his illness. But then on the following day, Hazael seized his chance and murdered the king in his bed, smothering him with a wet towel. So Hazael did indeed become the new king of Syria. Well, more time passed, and the kings of Israel and Judah, related to each other as descendants of Ahab and Jezebel with a political marriage between their families, joined forces against Hazael, king of Syria. And in the battle that followed, Jehoram, king of Israel, was badly wounded and retreated back to Jezreel, where he was visited by his uncle, the king of Judah. Elisha took action again. He sent a messenger from the band of prophets with whom he lived to go to Ramoth Gilead and find and anoint the soldier Jehu in private and persuade him to become the future king of Israel, and then to flee quickly. Jehu was duly anointed in the name of Yahweh with a commission to put an end to the whole family of Ahab and take revenge on Jezebel for her persecution of the prophets of Yahweh. Well, when he returned to his companions and told them what had happened, they all rallied round him and swore their allegiance to him. And he swore them to secrecy before they all together made a rebellious move to go to Jezreel in Israel. When the sentries on duty at Jezreel saw the large group of soldiers approaching in their chariots, they sent out messengers asking them if they came in peace. But each time, the messenger joined the group coming towards them. And the worried sentry then reported this to the wounded king and his uncle, the king of Judah, because he had recognized Jehu, saying, "It looks like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives like a maniac." And both the kings went out to meet Jehu, unsuspectingly, each in their own chariot. And they got as far as the former property of Naboth, which was near Jezreel. And they asked Jehu if he came in peace. Jehu's answer was, "How can there be peace when your mother still lives?" Jehoram shouted treason and turned to flee. But Jehu drew his bow and shot him in the heart. Jehu then ordered that his body be lifted out of the chariot and left to rot on the vineyard land that had formerly belonged to Naboth. Jehu then pursued the king of Judah and ordered that he too be shot. He was mortally wounded, but managed to get to Megiddo before he died. But his followers took his body back to Jerusalem for burial. Meanwhile, Jezebel at Jezreel became aware of what Jehu was doing, and proud woman that she always had been, she prepared herself for the inevitable. She put on her finest clothes, she groomed herself, put on her makeup, painted her eyes, and put on her queenly crown. She then looked out of the upper window and accosted Jehu on his arrival. He merely shouted to her servants to push her out of the window, and they did. And she collapsed and died on the ground, where her body was trampled by all the horses that had come. and it remained there while Jehu went in to celebrate his success. But eventually he gave orders for her burial, saying, "See to that cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." But when they went to carry out his order, they found that the dogs had had a very good meal, and only her skull, her feet, and her hands were left. Elijah's prophecy had at last been fulfilled. Well, King Jehu continued his campaign to rid Israel of all the influence of Ahab and Jezebel. He exterminated, and this is where the story turns really horrible, he exterminated 70 more of their descendants in Samaria and more in the kingdom of Judah, until there were no more, or so he thought. He then tackled Jezebel's Baal legacy. He pretended to be a worshipper of Baal Melkart and announced a solemn assembly for Baal, requiring the presence of all Baal prophets, priests, and worshippers. And they all came, filling the temple of Baal in Samaria from wall to wall, we're told. All the sacred vestments were brought out for them to wear, while he made sure there were no followers of Yahweh present. Jehu then gave orders to his men to let no one escape. And as all the sacrificial acts came to their climax, Jehu gave the order, his soldiers entered and killed the lot of them. They then destroyed all the fertility symbols of the Baal together with the temple itself, and the site was then made into a public loo. And here's a postscript, and I've called it The Survivor. Well, this brings us to the end of the Elijah cycle of stories in the northern kingdom of Israel, and also the deaths of almost every member of the royal families of both north and southern kingdoms. It's a very bloodthirsty story and does little to inspire us, except for one hopeful incident in the survival of a baby, a descendant of King David. The story centers on the daughter, Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel in Israel. She'd been married off in that political marriage to the king Jehoram of Judah to seal the peace treaty between the two kingdoms. But Queen Athaliah proved to be the replica of her mother Jezebel's ruthless ambitions. Well, Jehoram killed all his brothers to eliminate any opposition, and then abandoned his father's and his grandfather's allegiance to Yahweh and the temple in Jerusalem in favor of Baal worship like his wife and mother-in-law Jezebel. What trouble for Judah. Well, the Philistines invaded Jerusalem again and carried off all his family, with the lone exception of one son who became King Ahaziah. And he it was whom Jehu had killed when visiting Jezreel. Well, when this king's widow, Queen Athaliah, daughter of Jezebel, heard that she seized the throne of Judah for herself. How did she do that? Well, by murdering all other claimants. That is, all her sons and her grandsons. And she ruled the roost for 6 years, fully endorsing the Baal worship of the Phoenicians. However, in concentrating on killing the menfolk, she missed what one of her daughters had done. The graphic story is told in 2 Kings chapter 11, but this is not for bedtime reading. Princess Jehoshaphat took Joash, the baby son of Ahaziah, who was later called Jehoash, and stole him away from among the king's children who were about to be killed. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Now, this bedroom was in the temple, where her husband Jehoiada was a Yahweh priest. And the child remained there secretly, unknown to anyone, for 6 years. Then Jehoiada, the princess, took decisive action. He summoned all the guards into the temple, and this is the priest. He summoned all the guards into the temple and swore them to secrecy, and then brought out this young lad, now 7 years old, the son of their former king. And then he organized all the guards into 3 groups and organized them to guard this young lad very, very carefully. And they did so. And while they carried out their guarding, they gathered all the weapons they possibly could lay their hands on and brought them into the temple. This is the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, remember. Then one day the priest Jehoiada brought them all into the temple to mount safeguards, and he brought out the young prince, placed him on a throne, and put a crown on his head. Then all the guards, and I quote, proclaimed him king and anointed him. They clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." Sounds almost modern, doesn't it? Except that we in England don't have to wait for the coronation of our new king. Back in Jerusalem, Queen Athaliah heard all the noise in the temple and went herself to find out what was going on. And I quote, "When she looked, there was the young king standing by the pillar according to custom, with the captains and the trumpeters beside him, all rejoicing. Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, 'Treason! Treason!' But they got her. They dragged her unceremoniously out of the temple and killed her." Thus, the bloodline of King David survived by that slender thread. The new king, who'd grown up in the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, made a covenant with the people that they should be Yahweh's people again, just like our new King Charles at his first privy meeting, if you watched it on the telly. Then in Jerusalem, soldiers swarmed into the house of Baal, destroyed it all, and killed the Baal priest Matan, after which, I quote again, "The city was quiet after Athaliah had been killed." And so we end session 16 with a new dynasty of Jehu on the throne in the north and a survivor of King David to continue his dynasty in Jerusalem. Our last comment must be to conclude that the work of Elijah is now complete. Jezebel's influence is at an end. Yahwism is again uppermost in both kingdoms, north and south. But remember, the hidden attraction of fertility worship is still lurking below the surface of official life. Well, next time we'll hear more of the story of the northern kingdom and its kings and the prophet Amos. And we come to the notice for next time, fortnight's time at 4:30, and I hope to meet you all again then. Thank you for coming. And the notes for today's session are on the table for you. So take a copy before you go. Thank you for coming.